all things Jira, and I'm back with another story. Today's story is about the Sodder family and how a house fire changed their lives forever. And please excuse my hair, it looks crazy. It's very humid outside, it's not doing what it's supposed to, and it'll probably look completely different by the end of this video. Before I get into the story, make sure you like this video, please subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment. George Sodder was an Italian immigrant. He immigrated from Italy to Pennsylvania. He stayed there, found some work for a while, and then he eventually found work in Smithers, West Virginia. So he began working as a driver. I believe he drove things back and forth to different construction sites. He worked at that and learned the job of trucking. He eventually owned a business driving coal and dirt around the country. And driving around the country, he met Jenny Cipriani. They eventually married and they settled down in Fayetteville, West Virginia. So Jenny and George settled down in Fayetteville, West Virginia, and they had 9 children. There were some sources that said 10, but I could only find the names of 9, so we're going with 9 for the purposes of this video. There was a very small Italian community there in Fayetteville. George and Jenny were both very well liked, but George was not shy about giving his opinion about certain things, especially his opinion on the leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini. He had very negative opinions about Mussolini. This caused really heated debates with himself and other members of the Italian community. Now, another thing about George is that he never told anyone exactly why he left Italy. So this made him kind of mysterious. Whenever people would ask, he would just change the subject. So no one knew exactly why. So of course, in a small community, rumors started to spread and people were saying things like he left because he was running away from people in Italy due to some shady business dealings. So during the fall of 1945, an insurance agent came to Jenny and George's home in an attempt to sell some life insurance. When the sales pitch wasn't going very well and George declined to purchase the policy, the insurance agent got really mad and started to yell and threaten George. He started to yell, "Your damn house is going up in smoke and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid for the dirty remarks you have made about Mussolini." Now, several weeks later, another man came to the home looking for work. Now, he walked around the Sodder property just trying to find things that he could do for work because he needed the money. He went around to the back of the property and found some fuse boxes. He told George that these fuse boxes were going to cause a fire one day. George told him that he had recently purchased an electric stove, and when they did that, they rewired the entire house and had the electric company come out and check, and that everything was safe and in good working order. So he dismissed the man and, said he didn't have any work for him. Now, even though he did have this electric work done to the house, he still called the electric company later and had them check, and they said that yes, the wiring was fine and everything was safe and in good working condition. So a few days before the fire, some of the older Sodder children said that they saw a man watching the younger Sodder children walk home from school on Highway 21. On December 24th, 1945, it was the night before Christmas. The children were all excited about Christmas. They didn't really want to go to bed early. The Sodder parents did. It was about 10 o'clock at night, and they decided to go ahead and go to bed. They told the children that they could stay up a little later if they promised to turn the lights off, finish their chores, and lock the door. So about 12:30, Jenny woke up because the phone rang. Now, they typically don't get phone calls this late at night, so Jenny got up and went downstairs to answer the phone. When she answered, she said that there was a woman on the line asking for a name that she didn't know. She could hear people talking and laughing in the background, and she said she could hear glasses clinking. And I believe she said there was music as well. So she told the woman that she wasn't sure who she was looking for. She told the woman she had the wrong number, and the woman laughed and hung up. So when she hung up, she realized that the lights were still on downstairs. She walked through the house. She walked through the downstairs and saw that the curtain was left wide open and that the door wasn't locked. So clearly the children had gone to bed, but they hadn't done any of the chores that they said they would do. So she closed the curtain, she locked the door, she turned off the lights, and she went back upstairs. So when she got back in bed, she said she was just about to fall asleep. She heard a loud bang and something rolling down the roof. She dozed off anyway, and she's unsure about how much time passed before she was woken up to the smell of smoke. She said she opened her eyes and saw that there was smoke rolling under her bedroom door. So she immediately woke up George, and they started to yell for all the children to get up and get out of the house. So George and Jenny, along with 4 of their children, were able to get out of the house. The children that were able to get out were Sylvia, Marion, John, and George Jr. When they got out of the house, they realized that 5 of the children were still inside. That was Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty. Now, those 5 children shared 2 bedrooms that were on the second floor. So George went back in the house to try to save his 5 children, but when he went in, the staircase was on fire. So he ran back out of the house to go get his ladder. When he went to where he normally kept the ladder was missing. So he went to start his coal trucks. He wanted to move the coal trucks to the side of the house so he could climb up the house into a window and then get the children out that way. He had 2 coal trucks parked on his property and neither would start. They also kept water barrels outside. They went to get the water barrels to try to use those to try to put out the fire so they could get inside. But the water in the barrels was frozen solid because it was December in West Virginia. George and some bystanders were trying to figure out a way to get into the house. Marion ran to a neighbor's home and tried to call the fire department. She attempted to call the fire department, but she didn't get any response from the operator. Another neighbor who saw the fire tried to call the fire department as well, and he didn't get any response from the operator. So he got into his car and he drove into town. He found the fire chief. He told the fire chief about the fire, and even though the fire department was only about 2.5 miles away from the Sodder home, it took them almost 8 hours to get there. They arrived at the Sodder home somewhere between 8 in the morning and 9 in the morning. Now, from what I've read, the reason for this is that the fire department was short-staffed. They didn't have anyone staying at the fire department. They had created some type of phone tree. So whenever a call came in, one person would get the call for the fire, and they would call the next person in line, and so on and so forth, until all the firemen were notified about the fire, and they would meet up at the fire station and head over to the fire. Now, clearly, this was not a good way to run a fire department. It actually only took 45 minutes for the Sodder home to be completely destroyed by the fire. Within 45 minutes, the Sodder home was completely leveled and there was nothing but basically ash left over. The only thing that still stood was the basement. So the fire department and authorities got there, like I said, between 8 and 9. So the police and firemen dug through the remains of the home, but they could not find any remains of the 5 children that were still in the home. They didn't find bones or anything. So the police chief and the fire chief determined that the fire was probably so hot that it cremated all 5 children during the fire. And the cause of the fire was determined to be faulty wiring. They put together a coroner's jury, and they determined that this fire was an accident and that all 5 children had died from either suffocation from the fire and that they were cremated in the process of the house burning down. About 4 days after they came to this conclusion, the coroner sent out death certificates for all 5 children, and George covered the remains of the home with 5 feet of dirt. And he made this a memorial to his children. Now, as weeks went on, George and Jenny became unconvinced that their children actually died in that fire. They didn't believe that the children were actually in the house at all when the fire started. Then one of the reasons they thought this was because when they were outside yelling inside for the children to come out, there were no screams or anything heard from the children inside. Now, another reason was their 2-year-old Sylvia was playing on the property after George had set up the memorial site for his children. The 2-year-old was playing on the property and she found a small rubber object on the ground. When George picked it up and inspected it, he said that it was a pineapple napalm bomb, and it was something that they used to use in war. Now, Jenny thought that maybe this was what she heard hitting the roof of the house that woke her up when she was finally starting to fall asleep that evening. So because Jenny did not believe that her children died in that fire, and she definitely didn't believe that they could have been cremated in that fire, she had spoken to someone that worked at a crematorium, and they told her that even with heats up to 2,000 degrees for 2 hours, you could not completely cremate a body. There will still be remnants of bone left over. Even when they do cremations, at the end, there are bones left over that they have to crush into a powder before they give the remains to the family. So Jenny decided to start doing experiments, and she started experimenting with different animal bones. She would put these bones in fire for different amounts of time, and every time she always had bone fragments left over. So of course, this convinced Jenny that there is no way that her children were cremated in that fire, and because there were no remains found, the children were likely not in the house at all. Now, there were several sightings of the children after the fire. Now, one woman said that during the fire, she saw all the children in a car riding with someone away from town. A woman that worked at a rest stop said that she saw the children in her rest stop in the restaurant and she served them breakfast. She also said that there was a car that had Florida license plates there at the same time. Another woman that worked in a hotel in Charleston said that she saw the children there at the hotel. She said she couldn't remember the exact date, and they were with 2 men and 2 women. They were all Italian. She said she started to have a conversation with the children, but one of the men did not want the children to speak to her. But once the man showed that he did not want the children to speak to her, she stopped trying to engage with them, but she did call the authorities. A few years later, George saw an article in a newspaper from New York. It was some children in an elementary school in New York. He thought that one of the children in the photo looked just like his daughter Betty. So he drove all the way to New York to find this child. So he found the child, he figured out what her parents' names were, and he attempted to talk to her parents, but they refused to talk to him and they refused to allow their child to talk to him as well. George and Jenny contacted the FBI for help. Now, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI at the time, said that this seemed like a local issue and that they would only lend their help if they got permission from the fire chief and from the police chief. The fire chief and the police chief declined their help. So George and Jenny hired a private investigator. This investigator said that he discovered that one of the people on the coroner's jury was also the life insurance agent that had threatened George and his family that fall prior to the fire. So several people in town were interviewed by this private investigator. He spoke to a minister in town, and the minister told him that he had heard the police chief was telling people that he had actually found a human heart in the remains of the home. He told them that he put the heart in a box and buried it somewhere. So the private investigator went to the police chief and spoke to him, and he convinced him to tell him where he buried this box. When they dug it up, they found that it wasn't a human heart at all. It was actually a cow liver. Later on, the police chief said that he purposely did this because he wanted to give the Sodder family some closure. In August of 1949, the Sodder family hired a pathologist to excavate the ground. So he went out there, he started to dig around. He found 4 pieces of human vertebrae. So he sent these pieces to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian tested it, and they found that they were human pieces of vertebrae, as the pathologist said. But they found that they belonged to a person that was either 16 or 17 years old. The oldest child in the fire, that supposedly died in the fire, was only 14. The Smithsonian also stated that these vertebrae had never been in a fire, and they were most likely brought in by the dirt that George used to cover the property and make that memorial ground for his children. This was all before DNA testing was a thing. The Smithsonian actually sent the bones back to George Sodder, and no one knows what happened to those bones. After the results from the Smithsonian came back, the governor of West Virginia at the time, Oakey Patterson, he did a press release and he stated that this investigation was finally closed. And he said anything further into this was hopeless, that the children were there in the home, they died in the fire, and that was that. Now, George and Jenny, they were not taking this. They still were convinced that their children were not in that fire and that someone had actually kidnapped their children from the home and set the fire as a distraction. George and Jenny paid to have a billboard put up on Route 16. Now, this billboard had the pictures of all 5 children that were missing. It also included information about the case, specifically that there were no remains found, that there was no faulty wiring. It also accused the police department of covering something up. Now, this billboard stayed up for 40 years. Now, there were lots of theories about this case, especially, like I said, in a small town, there's always rumors and things like that going around. So some people said that those 5 missing Sodder children were actually back in Italy, where George was from. Some people were saying that the Sodder children were living in Florida with Jenny's distant family. Several people that said the oldest missing child was actually in a convent somewhere. And there were also several calls from places like Texas and I think Illinois stating that they saw one of the Sodder boys all these years later, I believe 20 or so years later, stating that they heard someone in a bar saying that he was Louis Sodder, but they saw another one of the Sodder children just out somewhere. And George actually went and investigated every single clue. Every tip that was called into them, he traveled to each state and investigated. He never found any of the children and he didn't find any answers. In some situations, it was found that was not one of his children, and in other times he didn't get any answers. He just had to come home with nothing. At some point, they hired another detective to go to Kentucky because they received a picture of a young man, and on the back of the picture it stated that it was Lewis. So they sent a private investigator down to Kentucky, but they never heard from this investigator again. They had paid him to go there and find out if that was their child or not, and they never heard from him again. George Sodder died at age 70 in 1969, and Jenny Sodder died in 1989 at age 85. Their youngest child, Sylvia, who was 2 when the fire happened, now she had always heard from her siblings and from her parents that her brothers and sisters did not die in this fire. So she actually kept their investigation going, and setting up tip lines and that type of thing. And she would get tips and send out investigators. I believe Sylvia is still alive, but right now her 2 children, her son and her daughter, have taken over her investigation. Her daughter stated that Sylvia promised to her mother that she would never let it go, and as long as she lived, she would continue trying to find out what happened to her siblings. So her son and daughter have taken that over for her. To this day, no one knows definitively what happened to the Sodder children, whether they actually did die in the fire or whether they were kidnapped for some reason. And of course, some of the rumors include that because George Sodder was so open with his opinion of Mussolini, that maybe some Italians that were fans of Mussolini decided to take that out on his children, and they took his children away from him. So that's my story for today. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment. Do you think that the Sodder children died in that fire, or do you think that they were kidnapped and the fire was set as a distraction? Let me know what you think in the comments. Please make sure you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and please share. I'll see you all again here next Wednesday at 10:15. Thanks for watching. Bye.